Let's move on to part 2 of building science. We're going to talk about more stuff on stacks, okay? We're talking about house as a system. We're going to talk about the different parts of a house. Then we're going to talk a little bit about air and moisture. Let's talk about systems thinking. Remember I mentioned that a house is a very complicated system. You can have air come in at one point, comes in through a hole in the outside of the house, and then it comes through the house and appears somewhere else. All of these things like dryer vents, electrical outlets, bathroom fans, recessed lights, attic hatches, crawl spaces, outdoor faucets, all of those things, every place you have a penetration in the house creates this complex system of air movement in and out of your house. This slide illustrates where you have air and pollutants and such entering at a rim joist. That can then move up through the exterior of your house and appear out places like outlets, plumbing penetrations underneath your kitchen sink. Most of the time you take a look up underneath your kitchen sink, right? You have your waste pipe coming out, and there is a giant hole. It looks like a gorilla just punched a hole in the wall so that they could get the pipe through. You have all of this complex air movement happening within your house. So just because you got air coming in at the baseboard here doesn't mean that if you went outside you're going to find a corresponding hole right there. Likely you're not. Let's talk about building our different types of a building. Some of you guys have been doing construction for a while. You know all about this. For others, this is a lesson. Okay? We'll start up here at the top. Up at the top of the roof, typically on the roof, you'll have these square metal vents. They're called turtle vents or roof vents. They allow warm air to escape out of your house. Those are roof vents. Oftentimes, modern, newer houses, they're a little more expensive, but they're a little more effective. You'll have what's called a ridge vent. So right at the very top peak of your house, you'll have a vent that runs the whole length of your house. That's a roof vent. We call that a ridge vent. Okay. Underneath, you have a soffit. We got a better picture of it before, but the soffit also has soffit vents in it. And basically it allows cool air to come in at the low part of your attic, move moisture out of the attic. So just by way of curiosity, do you know why we ventilate an attic? Primarily it's a moisture issue, okay? Because we want to keep the area dry, okay? Ice damming happens as a result of inadequate insulation in the attic. So we have a house, and we have our turtle vent, and then we have our soffit vent. Air comes in and goes out like that in our attic. And as that air comes in, it takes any excess moisture that's in that attic out with it. If we have adequate insulation, we still have moisture issues. But the heat, we don't care about because we don't live up there. Conditioned space is the space that you heat or cool the air, you condition the air. So it's basically living space. Building components. We have here what's called a vaulted or cathedral ceiling. We have above ground windows, more roofing system. This is above ground wall, below ground wall. Now, when they dig a foundation, they have to dig a hole that's bigger than the foundation itself. So they dig a hole that's bigger, then they form up the foundation, pour the foundation, or put the block in the foundation, whatever. They get the foundation in there, and then they have to bring the dirt back up to the outside of our foundation wall. That dirt that they use to fill in is called backfill. Here we have another look at our cathedral ceiling. Now, our cathedral ceiling can happen in two different situations. You might have a room that has what people are often referred to as a vaulted ceiling. So it's about 1.5 stories or it's 2 stories tall. Or you may have an attic that's been basically converted into living space, where you have a house and then you have an attic area, and then in the middle of the attic you've created, a room has been created, okay? So you still have attic space, but inside you have living space. These little pony walls or partial walls we call knee walls. A knee wall separates conditioned space from unconditioned interior space. For example, a knee wall would separate a room from the attic. A knee wall may separate the basement from a crawl space. Knee walls typically will have an air barrier on one side like a drywall. They should be insulated, and they should have some kind of plastic air barrier on the other side, but usually they don't. Above grade walls, we call this a tuck-under garage. Be mindful of tuck-under garages, okay? Pay particular attention to these, because tuck-under garages usually have bedrooms, secondary bedrooms, over the top of them. And what happens is above that tuck-under garage, you'll find 2 conditions. Condition number 1 is that there's no insulation in the roof of that garage to begin with. Okay. Condition number 2 is you'll have a 12-inch cavity with 8 inches of an 8-inch fiberglass bat. And what happens to that fiberglass bat is over time, its own weight begins to pull it away from the floor, creating an air gap in between itself and the floor above it, allowing air to come in over the top of it. So now, even though you have insulation in that cavity, it's basically worthless because it's not next to the area or the space that it's trying to insulate. To fix that condition, let's say we had a tuck-under garage, the roof has insulation in it, but it's inadequate, it's started to fall down, the space above it is cold or hot. We then go in and we, just like we were going to insulate a wall, we'd put holes in each cavity and fill it up with fiberglass or cellulose insulation. Yeah, so we'd blow insulation in and we would completely fill that cavity. Whether it be 10 inches, 12 inches, 14 inches, whatever that cavity depth is, we would fill it all the way up with insulation. Okay, so you have your tuck-under garage. You have your floor joist, right? And a wall of some sort, right? Okay. So this is, let's say 14 inches. And so we came in and we put an 8-inch bat in here, okay? And we're good. But over time, that 8-inch bat is now here. Okay? Well, didn't we say that air leaks in here and in here? Now you can get 20-degree air in here and start sucking heat out of this room. I do not like bat insulation in an attic.
Why?
Because when you roll out 2 batts of insulation, okay, so you're up in your attic, right? Your attic looks like this, right? Okay. If you have truss system, this is a 2x4, right? Yes. So it's 4 inches high. But I want to put R30 in my attic, right? So I take and I put a bat in here, and I put a bat in here, and I put a bat in here, and I put a bat in here. And these are, 10 inches high. So these stick up over the top of the ceiling joist, right? Okay. What's in between each one of these? Air. Right? And it's 20 degrees in my attic, 72 degrees in my house, and now 20-degree air can make its way down along the edge of my insulating bats, make its way down between the bat and that 2x4. And, if I didn't get that 2x4 laid perfectly flat against the drywall of my ceiling, now there's an air pocket, right? And we know that air is lazy and warm air rises, right? So we create a nice little pocket of warm air between the drywall and the insulation. And then that warm air, because it wants to rise, will migrate itself around and find an escape route into the attic. So I prefer to see blown insulation because blown insulation gives you a nice even covering over the entire attic surface. I always recommend, even if you have enough insulation, if it's bats, blow an inch or 2 of cellulose or fiberglass over the top of it, just to fill in the gaps. Let's talk a little bit, though, now about the way houses are built and the way they get framed. Back in the day, when they used to do what's called stick frame houses, we had a method of building houses called balloon framing. And balloon framing went away in about the middle 50s. But basically the concept was you poured the foundation, and let's say you had a 2-story house. You poured the foundation, then on top of the foundation, you would build 2-story high walls. And then you would stick frame the roof and then install the floor in between. That was way back in the day. Like I said, the middle 50s. By the middle of the 50s, we weren't building houses this way anymore. Okay? So a balloon framed house has some unique energy challenges. Okay, and that's the reason why we talk about this. Because we have a wall that goes from the basement all the way to the attic. And remember, we didn't really start insulating houses in earnest till we got into the 80s, right? So back in the 50s, you're going to find balloon framed houses with no insulation in the walls. A lot of times you'll also find those with no bottom plate and no top plate, which means that you have a clear path from the basement all the way up the wall into the attic, which means you warm up and heat your basement, and that air goes uncontested up the wall and into the attic. Okay? So these are one of the challenges of a balloon framed house. Now, how do you recognize a balloon framed house? There's usually 2 telltale signs of a balloon framed house. When you get into the attic, there are no truss work. There's no trusses. And when you get into the attic, you see what's called rough sawn lumber. What rough sawn lumber looks like is like your 3-year-old took a saw and cut the lumber. okay? We look at modern 2x4s, they're smooth, like sanded and everything, got rounded edges on it. That's not rough sawn lumber. Rough sawn lumber looks, I mean, it's rough sawn, right? When you see it, you'll know it. Let's talk about rough sawn lumber versus dimensional lumber. Actually, that's not right. A 2x4. What size is a 2x4? Mark? 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches if it's dimensional lumber. If it's rough sawn lumber, what size is a 2x4? 2 inches by 4 inches. That's right. Okay? So understand that when you do calculations and you say, okay, you're measuring the depth of a wall cavity and you go, wow, it's only 3.5 inches. Okay? That doesn't mean it's a 2 by 3.5. It's a 2x4. So in the middle of the 50s, we decided that there was a better way to build houses. Now, mind you, a 24-foot long 2x4 is really, really expensive. Okay? It's a lot less expensive to get 8-foot, 9-foot long 2x4s. Okay? So we came up with this concept called platform framing. You guys have seen it for years. You know how this works. They dig a hole in the ground, they bore a foundation, then they put this sill up, and then they put floor joists on. And then they sheet the floor joists. And now you have a platform. Then they build the walls for the first story. Exterior, interior, everything gets built. Then they take and run floor joists across that first story. They sheet it, and now you have a second platform for which you build the second story of walls on. Then they fly trusses and land them on top, and then you have truss work for your attic ceiling roof area. Okay? That's the concept of platform framing. Now, platform framing, in addition to being less expensive than balloon framing, also creates some energy advantages for us because it breaks up every single floor. Okay? Interior walls and exterior walls don't connect to the floors above. Also, if you imagine that air being able to go from the bottom story all the way up to the attic, that also means that if a fire starts, the fire can also easily spread all the way up the wall to the attic. So one of the things that we also started doing is putting in what's called fire blocking, which is simply a 2x4 that goes across and blocks the movement of fire, but as a consequence, it also blocks the movement of air. That's pretty nice. Works out good. Okay? So this is the basic difference, and you can see this in this slide, right? You can see the bottom plate, the top plate, the floor joists, those areas get separated. But the weakness of this platform framing is that framing member that goes around each platform, okay? That's either called a rim joist or a band joist, depending on whether it's at the foundation or up above in between stories, okay? That is a thermal weak spot in our building. And unfortunately, especially at band joists, because we have a floor above and we have a floor below, we've got sheeting on top and drywall underneath, typically those band joists cannot be accessed to be sealed. So we have a lot of air leakage happening in the space in between floors. Cathedral ceilings. Typically, one more word on cathedral ceilings. Cathedral ceilings are challenging to insulate because they have limited space. Usually they're 2x8s or 2x10s, right? Okay, 2x8s, 2x10s. which means that the most that you can safely insulate is about 8 inches, because you still need some air moving on the top side of the insulation. So you wouldn't necessarily fill up that entire cavity. Although if you're doing a retrofit, there's no way to blow insulation in and still leave a appropriate gap. So in that case, you would fill the entire cavity. But still, you only get 8 to 10 inches of insulation, which is usually not adequate. I mean, you know, you're usually talking about an R25 at the most. Okay, R25, maybe an R35. Okay, but you're not with a typical cathedral ceiling. You're challenged to get to your R39 that you're shooting for. This basically outlines our roof detail. This is our roof shingles, our facade, our soffit, band joist, knee wall, drywall. This is just a look at the different components and basically what they're called, so that you can have an intelligent conversation with your homeowner when you're talking about the soffit vents, or looks like the fascia board on your house is starting to rot in the corners, you know, because it's the fascia board that your gutter's attached to, right? So just understanding what all these different building components are will help you. Now let's talk about systems thinking as it relates to moisture management. Some of the problems associated with too much moisture are material degradation, often referred to as dry rot. It's actually wet rot, for all, you know, if we're going to be accurate about it, okay? Staining, we've all seen this. Warping, when we get wood wet, it warps because it expands, and not all at the same rate. So we get warping happening. As a result, we get structural damage, mold growth, and other moisture-related issues. It really only takes a small amount of consistent moisture to cause a problem. Reduced R values for insulation when insulation gets wet. This is particularly a problem with cellulose, which is really just chopped up newspaper. And we all know what happens when paper gets wet. It turns into paper mache, but it will hold a lot of water, okay? So a roof leak into an attic that has cellulose in it can easily take out a ceiling. We get deterioration and rot. We also get mold and mildew. Here are some rules for moisture. We get sources of moisture like cooking, showers, plants, fish tanks, people, swamp coolers, evaporative coolers. All of these things add moisture into the air. We already know that wet goes to dry, right? But water vapor tends to move from warm to cold. Why do you think that might be? Why does water vapor tend to move from warm to cold? As temperature goes down, relative humidity goes up. So as the moisture goes down, we start to squeeze the moisture, and then eventually we squeeze the moisture out of the air. Water vapor condenses into liquid form, and that's based on temperature, and we talked about the rules of that and the rules of relative humidity. So as temperature goes up, relative humidity goes down, and as temperature goes down, relative humidity goes up. As a result of the temperature near things like glass and walls and cold surfaces, the air temperature there is cooler, it tends to create condensation. The dew point is really the temperature at which saturation occurs. Dew point is 100% humidity. That's the temperature at which 100% humidity occurs. Relative humidity, again, it's the measurement of the moisture in the air relative to the amount of moisture that the air could hold. Warm air can hold more moisture than cooler air, and relative humidity depends on the air temperature. As air temperature goes up, relative humidity goes down. Now let's talk about how moisture moves through a building. We have two primary ways that moisture will move through a building. The first is by diffusion. Diffusion is moisture moving through a solid, like drywall, like sheeting, moving through the solid. Infiltration, however, is moisture moving through an opening in the building, straight up hole in the building. To control those things, infiltration and diffusion, we use what are called air barriers and vapor barriers. Infiltration, water moving by infiltration, the water comes with the air that's coming in the building. So if we stop air from coming in the building with an air barrier, we stop the moisture that comes with it. A vapor barrier stops diffusion. Moisture will come through the material, hit the vapor barrier, and condense and run down the vapor barrier and back out of the structure. Let's talk about the significance of the difference between infiltration and diffusion, okay? By diffusion, if we allow moisture to diffuse through a 1 foot by 1 foot square of drywall over a 12-month period of time, we will have half a glass of water, 6 ounces. So 6 ounces of water, not really that big of a deal. Not over the course of a year, right? Now, let's take that same 1 foot square and let's just cut it out. We actually will get 228 gallons of water through that 1 foot opening in our building over the course of 12 months. Now let me ask you this question. Could you afford to dump 228 gallons of water in your house? Just to reiterate, we take a 12-inch by 12-inch square of drywall and we look at how much moisture comes in by diffusion, 6 ounces over a year. We take that same 12 by 12 square, we cut it out and just let air move in. That air will bring with it over 220 gallons of water over that same 12-month period of time. The concept or the idea being air barrier is more important to moisture management than even a moisture barrier, okay? Because you can move a lot of air, you can move a lot of water with air. When we have open interior walls and chaseways, we can, if they're not managed properly, create what are called thermal bypasses. And a thermal bypass is simply a way for us to move heat around the instruments that we have put in place to keep the heat from moving. For example, we talked about the thermal barriers in our pressure barrier, right? Our thermal barrier is made up of insulation. And when we have insulation in place, it stops radiant heat from radiating, right? We put our drywall in place and it keeps air from moving, right? We put those two things together and we have a thermal pressure barrier. But when we do things like this and we put up drywall, but we don't put any insulation behind it because this is really technically an interior wall, and then we don't put any kind of insulation on top or we leave the top of this open, now we've created a way for the heat to bypass our measures, okay? And we call that a thermal bypass. Now, we also talked about convective heat loops. So if we have, for example, an interior wall, and at the top of that interior wall, for some reason, we're missing the top. I'll give you a perfect example. So we have a wall, okay? And I saw this, I'll use this example because I saw this in the house. So over here, there's a 2-story or a near 2-story entryway, okay? And up here is the attic. And we've got lots and lots of information in here, okay? Then over here, we drop the ceiling down just a little bit. But this is an interior wall, and it extends all the way up to the higher ceiling. Now, it's an interior wall, so it doesn't have any insulation in it, right? Okay. There's drywall on this side. There's drywall on this side. There's drywall here. We have insulation here. What's not there? There's no insulation there, but what else is not there? There's no drywall there, right? So we have no insulation inside here. We have no drywall up there. So I'm going to warm up the air inside that wall. Warm air rises, right? Warm air rises. Warm air rises into the attic. It's a classic thermal bypass. Some of the other places that you see thermal bypasses, like in this slide, plumbing penetrations. You see these in the basement underneath the bathtub, right? Now you have air that you've heated in your basement, which is now making its way up the wall. You now have a thermal bypass. I'd seal both sides. Seal the bottom side of this, seal this hole up on the bottom side, seal the hole up on the top side. In every case, whenever you have an access into a wall, especially an interior wall, that access should be sealed. If we have a plumbing penetration at the top of our wall, and we seal that plumbing penetration at the top of our wall so the air can't get out at the top, then it won't pull air in from the bottom, okay? It's still an interior wall, so we're still going to be heating the air inside the wall, but the air can't escape, so we're okay. Let's talk about some of the solutions to moisture management. The first one is a vapor barrier. A vapor barrier simply stops the migration of water through diffusion. Climates that are high humidity climates tend to be on the outside. Your vapor barrier tends to be on the outside. When you have dry climates where most of the humidity is inside, the moisture barrier tends to be inside. Thermal and pressure barriers help us to manage building temperature as well as moisture. They also help us to manage air movement, not allowing air to leave or enter the building unless we give it permission to do so. When we look at conditioned space is actually the space that we have conditioned with air, like our heater or with our air conditioning. Okay, typically interior space where we live. Our thermal and pressure barriers also restrict convection. And we talked about the convective loop inside of a wall. Now we know that air is lazy. So air inside of a wall was going to have to work a lot harder to move in and out of the small air spaces that's in insulation in order to create a convective loop. Okay, so that insulation severely restricts the movement in a convective way. Our pressure barrier, which stops our air, restricts diffusion of moisture. And in order to have these the pressure and thermal barriers to be effective, these two barriers must be both continuous and aligned with each other. If you have a continuous air barrier and a continuous thermal barrier, but they are not aligned with each other, we create a thermal bypass. Let's use this one as an example. We have an air barrier here. Okay. We have an air barrier here. Here's our thermal barrier. Okay. You see how these are not we have a hole here. Thermal and pressure barriers contain our heat by controlling our leakage of air. So if we stop air, conditioned air from leaving our building to begin with, then we actually stop that conditioned heat from leaving our building, okay? So any material that prevents the transfer of air through it can be used as a pressure barrier, like drywall, glass, concrete, okay? All of these things constitute a pressure barrier. When it comes to a thermal barrier, it's any material that prevents the transfer of temperature through it, like insulation, or what we call thermal mass, which is a heavy, really thick, solid wall of concrete or brick or rock. More examples of air barriers are things like sheeting OSB. Based on the location of where we're building, really determines what kind of materials we're using for each one of these items. I want to talk a little bit more about the alignment of air barriers and a thermal barrier. In order for insulation or our thermal barrier to be effective, we have to have an air barrier on all 6 sides. When we think about a wall cavity with a fiberglass bat stuck in it, right? We have an air barrier on 4 sides in that we have a bottom plate, a top plate, and 2 studs. Then we have sheeting on the one side, and then we have drywall on the other. Now, why do we have to have an air barrier on all 6 sides of insulation? So no air can get through there, because fiberglass makes a really good filter, but it doesn't stop the movement of air. Now, when you look at an attic, we put insulation in an attic, we have an air barrier on 5 sides, right? Why is it okay to have 5 sides in the attic? So it allows moisture to get out, for one, but if we've done our job properly, and we haven't, okay, there's actually a moisture barrier underneath our insulation so that moisture from the house doesn't get in the insulation to begin with. Okay, it has to do with the orientation of our attic. Okay, if we look at a wall, for example, we have, what's that effect that's trying to push air out? Stack effect, right? So stack effect is working on our walls. But what's working on the outside of our walls? Wind effect is working on the outside of our walls, okay? So it's important. We're seeing pressures from all 6 sides of air trying to move through our insulation. However, when we look at the attic sits flat. So what's affecting the attic, or what's affecting the ceiling from below? Yes, stack effect, yes. Stack effect is trying to push air from the outside, from the inside out, right? Wind effect is affecting what part of the attic? The edges, right? Okay. What's happening on the top? Nothing, really, right? So we have some air moving through the attic a little bit, okay? Now, interesting thing about insulation in the attic. Insulation in the attic done properly is usually about 14 inches thick. Now, if that insulation is fiberglass, after about 3.5 inches, it gets so difficult for air to move through that fiberglass. Basically, you can say that the rest of the 11 inches of fiberglass has no air moving through it. But what's cool about cellulose is that cellulose tends, you have this little bit of moisture that's moving in and out of your attic. Well, that moisture settles in on that top layer of cellulose and creates a crust. So it actually creates a solid crust across your cellulose installation, and you can actually regain that 3 to 3.5 inches of fiberglass that you lose by covering it with a layer of cellulose. So what does insulation do? Insulation slows the transfer of heat. The question is, what kind of heat transfer does insulation slow? So is it radiant, is it convection, or is it conduction? It's all of it, isn't it? So really, insulation is good for all of those things. It stops all of those things. Where do we put our thermal and pressure barrier? As we're looking at this particular picture, okay, we see our ceiling and wall assemblies, and we see that the thermal barrier is at the attic and at the wall insulation. And we also see that our thermal barriers and our pressure barriers are aligned with each other. As you take a look at this slide, this is a one-story house above grade. It's got a fully conditioned basement, and it has a vented attic. If you have a highlighter, I want you to take the highlighter and I want you to highlight this picture where you see, well, actually, I want you to highlight this picture where you think the pressure barrier and the thermal barrier should go on this structure. Okay? One story above grade, conditioned basement, vented attic. If you don't have a highlighter, just mark it with your pen. So this is a common question that folks ask. The basement floor, okay? My question to you is, how do you make the basement floor not a pressure barrier? Just by virtue of the fact that there's a floor here on your basement, doesn't that stop air if you got concrete on the floor? Okay, so that naturally makes it part of your pressure thermal barrier, right? Okay. So all the way up the walls, across the ceiling line, across the basement floor line, okay? That is your pressure, thermal pressure barrier. I want you to define the pressure and thermal barrier, where it should go in your book with your highlighter or your pen. Let's start in the lower left-hand corner of the building. I'm guessing that everyone has the floor of the basement, okay? Okay, as our pressure thermal barrier. Then we start up the wall. And we head up the wall, up the wall, up the wall until we hit the ceiling line, right? Is everybody still with me? Okay, then we turn right and head across the ceiling line, right? Then we start down, and then we hit this spot where you can either go straight or turn left, right? Okay, how many say straight? How many say turn left? How many don't have a clue? Okay. You know, the funny thing about this is that you're both right. We have an option of going either direction. If we wanted to use this space, for example, as a closet space, okay, so let's say that this space was big enough to put some closet space in there, then of course we want to insulate at this level. Okay, if this area, we've seen these, especially you framing guys, right? The porch kind of sticks out. You know, there's no living space in there at all. It's just there so that when you walk up to the door and it's raining, you stop getting wet. Okay, but there's nothing of any value off in there. In that case, we just bring it straight down to here. So in any case, when we get here, if we came down, when we got there, we headed out this direction. If we went this direction, then we came back to this wall. Okay? Then we dropped down the wall till we got here. And then we got the big question. Is this crawl space conditioned, unconditioned? What do you say? According to this slide, this is a conditioned crawl space. Okay? So consequently, we're going to just keep coming right down, back to the foundation, and around to where we started at. It's only a conditioned space if the room that we live in shares its air with that closet space. So let's say, for example, let's say this is, we don't intend this to be conditioned space, okay? But we have an attic access door into that space. And that attic access door is not sealed. So the air in the room can easily get into that attic space. Okay? That attic space can actually become conditioned space. Again, this goes back to, you know, you've been getting this answer from me that it depends. But as a building analyst, we have to analyze what we know. We can't assume anything. We can't make it up. Somebody mentioned yesterday, you know, do we call ahead of time and ask the homeowner to set up the house so that it's as efficient as it can be when we get there?
That was me.
That's not what we want to do, right? We want to look at the facts. We want to look at the homeowner, the way they live.